we work with tribal communities in the same way that we work with Pastor Moses to protect their sacred places. They see us as relatives. They see us as a community that worked together when they were being, by the state of California, the law was to exterminate them. And so they see our numbers are larger, and they see that we share some of the common values, and so I do think that they're very, very important allies for us to work with. But building trust and long-term relationships is the key.
My grandfather used to always say, "En cada cabeza hay un mundo," right? And everyone's head is its own world. And I think that that's, for all of the passion and excitement and drive to hear from all of our panelists, we also know that we're dealing with a much larger community who all has different versions of it. And I think that speaks a lot to the conversation of the generational divide in particular. The vantage point is different. We see it from a different lens. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to go in the same direction. And and again, back to the way I think about organizing is that we're not reinventing the wheel, or we don't have to. Fall back on what we know from our culture, from our heritage. Entre nosotros, we take care of each other, right?
Yeah.
That's the idea that we have to go with in our organizing. Together, we're going to move forward. And that, and families do it without thinking about it, right? But so many of our families are intergenerational. We have from all the way from the little kids up to the abuelitos, and everyone's together all the time. We know how to interact with each other, and we know how to communicate with each other. We have to put that, our organizing hats, we have to look at it from that lens of how do our families communicate. And then I think part of it is listening. And I think that sometimes when we're organizing, we don't necessarily listen, because if folks aren't getting on board with what we're talking about, we're not communicating appropriately or effectively, right? And so we have to speak to folks the way they want to hear it. And I think that that's a disconnect, I think, and why sometimes we get these little groups of people. Because, even here in Washington, we have the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda that Mi Familia Vota and CHCI are part of. And those are the 45 large national Latino organizations. And we sit at one big round table to discuss large issues, right? I'm from Texas. I grew up just outside of Houston, Baytown. I was probably a teenager before I realized that not every Latino in the United States was a Mexicano, right? Because everybody was Mexicano where I grew up. And so coming to Washington, DC in my early 20s, realizing that there is a very strong Cuban, Puerto Rican, Central American contingency and power structure, that was very strange for me to understand. And so, I think that part of it is so many of the other panelists have said this, we need to listen to each other, and they need to figure out, okay, todos juntos, how are we moving forward? And then, I think that's the important lesson to take from the conversation.
So I was so glad that one of the questioners in the previous panel raised the issue of Spanish-speaking people in prison, because in spaces like this one, we often don't even want to touch that issue with a 10-foot pole, right? I mean, Donald Trump, of all the racist things he did, one of the most racist things, perhaps the most racist thing, was his association of, Mexicanness with criminality. And of course, it's so important to fight back against that. But in fighting back against that, we often just don't want to even acknowledge, the fact that there are individuals who, in fact, end up enmeshed in the criminal justice system, right? And end up in prison, end up in jail. And we throw them under the bus by just not even wanting to talk about them, right? And what that results in is just, leaving aside sort of the morals or ethics of it, it results in bad outcomes from a policy perspective. Because if you look at the DACA program, which is, really one of the greatest things that's been done in the past 15, 20 years, right? The DACA program, you can lose your DACA. You can have had DACA for 11 years now, and you can lose your DACA for a single DUI, one, right? 0.1 over the limit on a Saturday night, and you can lose your DACA that you've had for 11 years. And there's no exceptions to, and I cannot count the number of, now people in their mid-20s, before people in, or even in their early 30s, just crying their eyes out in my office when I tell them that as a result of this one bad mistake that, having 2 beers too many on a Saturday night, they're going to lose their legal status now. And there's no waiver and there's no exception to that, right? And the reason that that is the case, I'm not in favor of DUI, right? Don't drink and drive, kids. But I mean, like, one should not lose your legal